Good afternoon and welcome. My name is David Jasper, and I look forward to spending the next hour with you as we unlock some of the secrets of the sea in poetry and theology. Before we begin, inevitably I've got some necessary notices to give out, so bear with me as I do that. First of all, to remind you that masks are required to be worn throughout the event and while moving about in the building. And we are following the government guidelines about track and trace, and your details have been gathered for that purpose. There's no fire alarm drill planned, so if there is a fire alarm, it will be the real thing. So if we hear it, please make your way to the exits as indicated around the building, and stewards will help you from there on. And finally, just the obvious, please keep a reasonable distance at all times, especially remembering that when we're leaving the room and the building. It's a great pleasure to introduce the two poets and the theologian and writer that we have with us today. So let me introduce very briefly our guests here before we begin. Christine de Luca, I think, is familiar to many of you. She was the Edinburgh's Macker. That's a Glaswegian speaking. The Edinburgh's Macker from 2014 to 17 has written 7 books of poetry, and her most recent is entitled Vive. She's also just completed her second novel. And there are books available, as for all our writers, in the stall outside. Our second speaker, whom we can see on the screen, is Ed Newell, a historian and an Anglican priest, and at present principal of Cumberland Lodge, an educational foundation in Windsor Great Park. And we'll be looking at his book, published in 2019, The Sacramental Sea, which Ed describes as a spiritual voyage through Christian history. And then our third speaker is Lizzie Smith, who describes herself on her website as a Scottish wild swimmer, singer, poet, and mother. She was born in Scotland and now lives in Edinburgh, where she is a teacher of literature. And her first collection of poems, Mermaid on Legs, was published in 2020. So without any more ado, I'll hand over to Christine.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David. I'm originally from Shetland, and that will maybe colour how I speak and some of the poems I read to you. I'm going to read 3 poems. The first is in English, and it's a slightly longish one, and then 2 in the Shetland tongue. I've chosen to concentrate on that area between land and sea. I find that fascinating area, the battleground really between land and sea, and the forces, the marine forces that shape the land there. And the beauty and the danger of the sea and the moods of the sea, and also I think the way our emotional well-being is sometimes shaped by the sea. The pictures you're seeing there, the first poem is set in this area, and you may recognise the Angus-Kincardine coast. That's the little village of Cataline. And that lovely horizon, if you take the train up the east coast, I think that's one of the most lovely horizons. But on the left is St. Cyrus, a little bit further north, and the beach there stretching down to the River Esk, and the old sand dunes and the old raised beach. I used to go there sometimes as a child when we were going on holiday. And then the beautiful farmscape, and then up to the glens of Angus. So I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with that territory. The poem is got, as its title, a line from Edwin Muir's Annunciation, Into the Ordinary Day, and the 5 parts each have a little subtitle which have a theological concept. And maybe you'll be able to pick out that little bit that just links into the subtitle. Into the Ordinary Day. Annunciation. The sun is high, the air stilled but shadowed by earlier selves. Children in the dunes, an uncle checking salmon nets. The tide is favourable. Driftwood lies here and there. Best not waste it, best not waste such moments. The river has swithered, changed course in its own good time, and the cliffs lost touch with the ocean. The Tiercel is their keeper, perched on the highest ledge. He surveys his policies of beach, of sand dune. Jackdaws avoid his killing place, strewn with bloody feathers. He keeps one eye on his mate as he tears prey apart. On the gorse, she too is vigilant. If only this unseasonal day could rewind, play and play again, then resolve itself, sense an ending, be content with the unknown. Incarnation. In the lobby is a photo of a fisherman's cottage. It could be this one. Granny baits the long lines. Coir twine moves rhythmically across her knee from one basket to the other. Calloused hands will wash children's faces, knit them gansies. They furrow their brows in bright sunlight. Another is of the men, their boat beached, set against a backdrop of nets. They'll sleep ashore tonight. Above one bed, stenciled stars. Above another, a selection of knots framed, blood knot bend with its 2 strings laid side by side, and a lark's head for the morning. Redemption. The stream, vertical on the corrie wall, seems stopped. Huge boulders on the lip are holding their breath. They are the keepers of stories, reminders of forgiveness. It is hard to forget. The footpath is demanding, wind in the face. This is retracing paths, forging new ones. No sign of nesting raven or falcon here. Only the heart lifts on updrafts, screams at the airy free fall. The homeward stride is always kinder, and the callishang of gulls on the skerry is far enough away to feel they might almost be rehearsing a lullaby. Transfiguration. Everything is profligate. The sun spilling gold across a morning ocean, bushes chattering with chaffinches, chimney stacks full of the amorous hurl of collared doves, insistent birds. Between ocean and glen is as good as it gets, all shades of terracotta where the soil is turned, and a pattern of impossible greens, a promise of grain and burnished rape, of starting over. For now, daffodils blazon the slopes, and pickers, bent from the waist, head down, ache their way, row upon row, shining figures in a landscape, pigments in a painting. Resurrection. the North Sea horizon, rediscovering the memory of it, the Heuch of Bay, cliffs soft and tilted, full of secrets of seabeds, of ice, of fluvial history, of rising. Stones pick themselves up, lodge artless in a hand shaped for holding. Retreating waves riffle through them, open-hearted. There is relentless sorting from end to end, from beachhead to waterline, stones with so many lives. This life, stroked by sun, washed again and again, is a rub-a-dub of love. Life at the cliff edge is precarious, precious. The stars will be pricked out again tonight, Orion to the Pleiades, Aries to Cassiopeia. Venus is tucked under Jupiter, at her brightest and best, and setting slowly, ever so slowly. And then a very different one, a sea in a different mood. This is set in Shetland, and it's written in the Shetland tongue. And I've put the English version on the other side so you can follow along, because I'm only going to read it in the Shetlandic. So the Breyer Disaster was the big tanker went aground in 1993, quite near the south end of Shetland at Quendel Bay. And this is just a little fable. It tells the story in the words of the puffin, the Taminori, the sheep, the otters, and finally the song of the sea. I can't see at this distance, so I'll have to read from the book. Voices o' Quendel Bay, the truttle o' the Taminoris. Your will want with Taminoris, nebs fu a ills, you think was cluns. We mak you gaff, look was i the in, and see was gowl. The njarm o' the yows. Sin a four ninian were lambs o' shamps, sat tang and war. The ebb is shulp at gage, quat na waggings, I were trots. The ooben i the dratsies. We turl i the sea for fun, hunt sweet fish, skirl freedom round creels. The tide is turned, we're elted noo, and lick pushin'. Oops, sorry. The sang o' the sea. Never late, I'm danced and I'm flet, smored yon gritty barrel, I shall meet you, cully about you wi' whitest fraud. So I shall feed you, comfort you with whitest surf. In fact, the sea, which had caused the damage to begin with, eventually cleared up a large part of the mess from the disaster. And finally, discontinuity, another one in the Shetland tongue. Discontinuity, you'll know, is a geological term for rocks which are of different age or type, rather close together. And there are places where you could put one foot on the Eurasian plate in Shetland and your other foot on the American plate. It's got a rich geology, varied geology. But this poem is a kind of a poem of ambivalence, I suppose. I was at home on holiday and I had found this beautiful big heart-shaped stone which was too heavy for my luggage in Loganair. So I propped it up on the cliff and hoped it might be there when I came back. There's a little bird there, you can see, the ringed plover, common on Shetland beaches, and we call him the sandy loo. So this is the moods of the sea and our own moods and our own ambivalences. I could blame the wide sea as smooth the stains, the silk a touch, the wailing, laving, And will the heart be there when I come back? Or I could blame the sandy loo. He was clear quite white again. This why no, nae looking o'er your shoulder, tide does no wet. See the wide swell of joy is drained. Dance the day, the morn you slip into eternity. Or I could blame the hush it fills you till you're like to burst wi' a' the words that could be said, but you had back. That's what happens when you step in time, but sense a fault line vimmering through you, this side or that. Only the sea can greet and sing at the same time, shade and light, cobalt, ultramarine, and then the linnebrack, a ties, a fresh white.
Thank you, Christine, for sharing with us the music of your own tongue as it combines with the music of the sea. I think you should also notice that Lizzie and Christine are both dressed as mermaids in appropriate colour to make us think of the sea present with us. We now move on to Ed Newell, from poetry to, I don't know, theology. Ed. We can't hear you at the moment, I'm afraid. Are you on mute?
No.
Fine.
That's okay. I'm sure far away. First of all, my huge apologies that I can't be with you. And unfortunately, I've gone down with COVID, so it's better for everyone that I'm locked up at home. I wish I could say that I was dressed as a mermaid, but I'm not. But I hope you might find what I'm about to say interesting. And I'd like to begin by quoting a writer that I admire very much indeed. And she wrote this, or she said this: "If there is poetry in my book about the sea, it is not because I deliberately put it there, but because no one could write truthfully about the sea and leave out the poetry." Well, that writer was a marine biologist, Rachel Carson. But arguably, her most important book wasn't a book about marine biology. It was actually a book about pesticides, Silent Spring. And this book, perhaps more than any other, has captured the public's imagination about environmental issues. Why? Well, it's not just because Rachel Carson was a gifted scientist, it's because she was also a gifted wordsmith. She had the remarkable ability to be able to communicate through the written word in a way that could touch hearts and minds. That's the power of really good literature. Well, a book, or rather a collection of books, that's probably done more to shape hearts and minds than any other in history is, of course, the Bible. So I'm going to share with you one of my least favourite Bible quotes. The quote is from the book of Revelation, and it's this: "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more." What a dreadful prospect. According to St. John the Divine, when the cosmos is perfected, there's no more sea. No more, to quote Christine, sun spilling gold across morning ocean. No more cobalt ultramarine, and then the breaking wave. To me, this is on a par with a spring without birdsong. No wonder then that D.H. Lawrence called this vision of the New Jerusalem beastly. So why then did John, on the island of Patmos, surrounded by the sublime beauty of the Aegean Sea, describe the perfected creation in such a way? Well, the answer is that in the thought world that he inhabited, shaped by Jewish apocalyptic and Near Eastern cosmology, the sea, or perhaps more correctly in this case the ocean, was regarded as the remnant of the primordial chaos from which God created the cosmos. This is evident in the opening of the book of Genesis, when God separates the waters of the deep, this primordial ocean, to create seas, lakes, and rivers. But the ocean remains around the edge, mysterious, chaotic, dangerous. Well, that sort of thought world no doubt emerged from the experience of the destructive power of the sea flooding parts of that region, also by mariners, those that managed to sail beyond the relative calm, tideless waters of the Mediterranean, out beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the wild, tidal Atlantic. They would have noticed a huge difference between the two. But what I set out to do in writing The Sacramental Sea was to try to make sense of this negative portrayal in what, after all, covers 70% of the Earth's surface. And the fact that for me, and I suspect for many others too, being on or being by the sea can be deeply spiritual. I grew up by the sea. I'm drawn back to it time and time again. It's the most natural environment for me to relax, to think, to pray. It's perhaps where I feel closest to God, and it speaks to me of God. And I guess that's why I find that passage from Revelation so troubling. Well, I started work on the book in 2008, and I finished it 11 years later at an average of 6 words a day. Now, had I known how long it was going to take, I probably wouldn't have started. But the truth of the matter is, once I got going, I realized that to do this subject any justice at all, I had to explore a vast range of literature. And I began quite naturally with theology and biblical history, but before long I was delving into psychology, geography, the history of science, poetry, literature, art, hymnody, and so on. And even now, I just realized I've only been able to scratch the surface because there's so much in this topic. But to cut 11 years story short, what I hope that I've been able to show in the book is how over time the Christian perception of the sea has changed, influenced by various factors, one of them being the use of the sea to spread the Christian gospel, also exploration and missionary activity by theologians grappling and beginning to understand the hydrologic cycle, better ship design and safety, and people being more confident about being at sea, and so on. No longer then are the oceans the remnant of chaos for us, but they're the source of life, of energy, vital for human connectivity. And I think this mind shift has had a literary dimension too. Romantic writers and poets help to transform the way that we engage with the harsh aspects of the natural world, from regarding them as frightening and ugly to awesome and sublime. The first thing that I did when I started my research was to consult a database of 6,000 accounts of religious experience that are held at the Religious Experience Research Centre at the University of Wales in Trinity St David at Lampeter. The accounts were collected by another marine biologist, Sir Alistair Hardy. After Hardy retired as Professor of Zoology at Oxford, he turned his attention to studying religious experience, and he collected lots and lots of these accounts. I wanted to see if I could find any relating to the sea, and I did. I found 81 of them. They were in 2 categories, but by far the largest category was quite striking. It was all these accounts were very, very similar. I'm just going to read one of them to you. It's an account written by someone who had been reflecting on an experience on walking along the west coast of Wales near Borth. And the person wrote this: "I was walking alone towards the sunset along the very fine cliffs and finally stopped and sat looking out to sea to watch the last moments of the sun's descent. I remember that the sky was immensely, profoundly blue and continued perfectly clear as the sun's light waned, and I distinctly recall this gave me a powerful sense of infinity, a reminder of huge tracts of space and galaxies many light years away. I also remember noticing the golden path of the sun on a calmish sea and the many signs around of the interaction of rock and water, the worn hollows and spines of one, and the ceaseless movement of the other. It was from this observation that my mind began to move in the direction of religious thought, but that is perhaps a misleading way of expressing the fact. The strongest memory I have is of a conviction pressing in on my whole being, not merely my mind, that the creation in front of me, its elemental forces, its huge complexity, was not complete or self-sufficient, but that behind it, within it, was the creator or ultimate reality." Well, I related very much to reading that, and it's precisely that sort of experience, sometimes called the oceanic feeling, that led me to write the book in the first place. A world without sea would deprive us of this sort of transcendental connection with creation. And as the writing project neared its end, I knew the conclusion was going to be that, for me at least, the sea is highly sacramental, by which I mean that it speaks of God in ways that go far beyond simply metaphor. And I was particularly struck by a phrase used by the writer Hilaire Belloc in his book, The Cruise of the Nona, which is his account of sailing around Britain, when he called the sea the common sacrament of the world. And it was really reflecting on Belloc's writing that led me to write this passage in the book. I wrote, "Over the centuries, a number of influential thinkers and writers have emphasized the sacramental dimension of creation, its ability, in the words of Michael Maine, to mirror the divine. It was Belloc, however, who appreciated more than most the breadth and depth of the sea's sacramental nature. He understood that it could create vivid images to fire the imagination, as well as clear the mind to contemplate ultimate mysteries. That at one moment the sea can seem a bountiful source of life, and at another, a vast barren wilderness. He understood too that the sea's capricious nature captures precisely the human condition with its varying moods, and the questions these can throw up about the meaning of life and the nature of God. Such questioning highlights a distinctive aspect of the sea's sacramental nature, the problem of theodicy. On the one hand, the sea is vital to our existence. Its place in the hydrologic cycle ensures we are supplied with life-giving water. It's an abundant source of food and increasingly a source of energy. It is something that gives pleasure and is life-enhancing. And yet, at the same time, it is dangerous and deadly. Its capricious nature speaks of God as the giver and taker of life, who also permits suffering. There is nothing sentimental about the sea. Its dangers are too well known." The final thing I'd like to say very briefly is that when I set out to write the book, I wasn't setting out to write about environmentalism. But the fact of the matter is that if one's attitude to the natural world is sacramental, it demands treating the world with respect and reverence. And so, quite simply, I had to end the book by making this point. The environmental crisis that we're caught up in requires us to be motivated to change our attitude to the natural world. We can have international summits and so forth. I believe there was one somewhere in the UK recently, I'm not quite sure where. But I would like to suggest that perhaps the simplest and most effective way, or one of the simplest and most effective ways of dealing with this is to give the task to writers and poets, and I would perhaps add musicians too, people like Christine and Lizzie, who have that remarkable ability to touch the soul and capture our imagination and to move hearts and minds, because that's what needs to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ed. And I think that takes us neatly into Lizzie herself and her own concerns with the environment and so on. And so could I ask Lizzie for you now to speak?
Thank you very much. What a treat to hear Shetlandic and to travel the seven seas with Ed Newell. So my first poem is to reveal a secret of the sea that will strike a chord with fans of Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid. So in this piece, it is revealed that there might be beings out there who are half angel, half mermaid. So my first poem is called Angel Mermaids. Falling 5 fathoms, mermaids feel weightless, even embracing bodies of sailors. Anchor tattoos plummet down to the seabed, while angel mermaids ascend, saving again. We can have a romantic view of the sea, so here is my sonnet to the sea called Sea Trove. Sea Trove, the twinkle of speckles of sand cascading in the sunlit wave, a pearl inside a nacred shell, the diamonds of salt between rocks, silver moonlight playing, the antique piles of rocks, secreting ancient ammonites, cowrie shells used as coin, the abounding blue gold of water, the harnessing of the zephyr breeze, and the towering tidal wave, from the ebony boom of thunder to the most intricate seahorse. These are the treasures of my kingdom. The voice of the speaker in this poem is a mermaid. She talks about my kingdom. Her kingdom is of the sea. In the world of the imagination, the way that I could express my sorrow for our treatment of the seas was to imagine myself as a sentient being of the water. And that being was a mermaid who is half fish, half woman. Through her body, I could vicariously feel the effects of oil in the ocean. Of course, in Scotland, the mermaid can be a selkie, a transformed seal. Here is a lament for the effect of oil on breeding seals. Here in this poem, they are keening for humans to stop being so insane. And this poem is called Winter Welkin Keening. Where can you find me when winter winds whistle? Under the welkin, white with frost, on a calm day when low tides plash and blue hills fade to vanishing point. In the biting breezes of the north, I bulk up blubber in defense and lie with my sisters far away from you, flapping my flippers to keep circulation. Nipples unsucked by searching mouths hibernate and hope for warmer dawns, where engine oil is not pumped out and swallowed up by wide-eyed pups. On a dry night when you're in bed, we rise for moonrights and dance round bonfires in a banshee frenzy, keening for a return to selkie sanity. I wrote these eco-poems while tramping the beaches in St Andrews, not far from here, full of despair for what was out there in the sea, because the Mermaid Sea has become a sewer and a dump for the people who dwell on earth. A poem about pollution in the sea is again from the mermaid's underwater perspective. I thought about how stars would look in moving water, and then the plastic that might come along and ruin the view. And this is called Under the Deep. From under the deep, the stars feel wet, like glowing jellyfish swimming above. The twinkles sway, bobbing like blobs, but untouchable. Light filters down at night. Discos for dolphins are far away. My cathedral is thronged by whales, beleaning mournful lullabies. Floating by on every side are lightweight bottles without a message. We'd like to throttle them before they choke us belly up. My next poem, What the Mermaid Saw, is a catalogue of objects that you and I have used and which one way or another have ended up in the sea. Earbuds, razors, and nets from catching the fish that we might eat. What the Mermaid Saw. Under the deep blue sea, what should the mermaid see caught in the waving weed? Jellyfish hanging a string, a castaway tampon. She can't do much with that. Seahorses riding on steeds made of weird earbuds, entangled, shackled down. There's an unsheathed razor, past nicking razor bills. Razor shells hate its cheek. Slicker than quiff of hair, gobs come of oil spewed out, bills of gulls, their calls choked. Scrabbling no more, a seal sporting a necklace net, glazed over big doe eyes. Muzzled by plastic ring, greatest of beasts laid low, sea lion casts his crown. In the kingdom above, their views obscured by screens, as all asphyxiate. I don't know what pictures you conjured up when you heard those images in the poems. Many of the verses were based on iconic photos of seals with nets round their necks and gulls caught in oil slicks. A topic for debate here is what is the power of literature? Polemic poetry has its place, but images will have impact and appeal to millions more people. The last poem I'm going to read today is published in a collection produced by the World Wildlife Fund along with wonderful wildlife photography. I was prompted to write the poem when I heard that parts of the enormous Totten Glacier were collapsing. The poem comes from the end of my collection, Mermaid on Legs, and fuses the two worlds of the Selkie, land and sea, for as we have been discussing, they are bound together intricately. This poem is a lament and a call to action, and is from a collection called Planet in Peril. Shutting up shop, last lay, and it has echoes of Silent Spring, a book that was mentioned earlier. And the sedge warbler shut up her basket shop down by the river, along with the lapwing, who had lost her field nest to the tractors again. And the corncrake croaked her last. And the village barber moved to the city mall. And the puffin skidded onto his home rock face, faint with hunger, and expired from lack of eels swimming in the warm seas. And the monger of fish was swallowed whole by a whale of a supermarket franchise. And the microbeads adorned the oysters and choked their pearls. And the Finisterre radio waves dried up. Only octogenarians were listening. A marginal audience of 1 million is easily jetsomed. And the Totten Glacier melted to become a tottering heap of snow and water, crying snowmen's tears into the salty sea. And another child's little lungs collapsed, choked from the fumes of 1 million cars and Bangkok tuk-tuks stuck in traffic jams. And the hedgehog landed on its back, feet kicking in the air, in his last attempt to cross the carriageway to Mrs. Tiddlywink. No longer trampled by hooves of horses, but squeezed out of invention by motor cars and jeeps. And the greengrocer failed to support its market gardeners. No more knobbly carrots and weird phallic shapes or potatoes with beautiful heart-shaped bottoms. And the morning chorus became muted. Every spring, the voices thinned until the voice of the turtle dove was heard no more in our land. Only the call of ravens sounded the knell of nature, should anyone have been listening with their earphones out. And so the lights in the high street went out one by one, until the offshore lot had made a desert of the heart of our community, and the voice of the turtle dove was heard no more in our land. I love the sea. I write sonnets to the sea, as I feel distressed by the sickening of a relative or a friend who should be hale and hearty. I feel for the state of our oceans. We know that they are our allies, storing great repositories of carbon, but they are already showing signs of change from warming. Let's keep our seas as a natural carbon sink, not our sewer. So I ask us all to think how we can save our seas in any way we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Lizzie, and may I thank all three speakers. Could we have Ed back, perhaps? Yes, there we are. Hello, we can see you again. Nice to see you. What struck me, I think, as I was listening over the last 40 minutes, as I'm sure it did you as well, is the range, the huge range of emotions that have been expressed around this relationship we have with the sea. Not sentimental, but going back to our childhood or things that we remember, to our anger that came through certainly in your poems, Lizzie, and also to Ed's impatience, quite rightly, with the Bible at times, which ends up in the heavenly city with no more sea. That's unimaginable for us, that there should be no sea. And we've already referred obliquely to COP26, which of course was a conference that was very largely about economic issues, how we save the world by shifting our economic values and so on, very necessary. But I'd really like to ask all three speakers just very briefly if they'd just to say a little bit more about what they feel the power of literature, and perhaps not least the literature of the Bible itself, what power it has to make any difference, to shift things, to push things on in this world that is so threatened, not least the sea itself. And secondly, looking back to, well, Christine, your poems that began all with religious titles, incarnation, redemption, resurrection. Your poems speak of mermaids saving us or saving again. And a lot of what you said, Ed, itself, although you speak as a theologian, was actually profoundly poetic. So how do poets feel themselves as religious writers? or how do theologians feel themselves as poets? And in the end, is there really very much difference? Before you answer, Christy, I mean, we were talking a bit earlier when in one of your poems you say that you still dream as a pagan. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And what does that mean exactly?
Well, what does it mean? I suppose I'm having been brought up 50 yards from the sea, and where the sky is huge, and you're very aware of the elements and the movement of the sun and the stars and the wind. I think that does have a kind of profound effect on the way you feel. And also in an area fairly rich with archaeology, the life of an early settler in the islands didn't feel all that different really from my own in some ways. We spent as much time as we could messing about in the sea, one way or t'other. But literature, I think anything which gets to the heart is probably going to have, to move people and maybe change the dial a little bit. I don't know if it can do as much as the visual image. I think some of the photographs that we see sometimes in these photographic competitions of the devastation of the world, they also move us. Our bank balance moves us as well. So I don't know where literature is in that rank, but I like to think that we can perhaps help people feel differently.
Not just feeling as well. I mean, in these poems, we were not only touching things, but smelling things, that all our senses were very much alive in your poetry, I felt, in both cases. So, Ed, how would you respond to that?
I think the thinking of writing theologically about anything, you're trying to express things that are almost inexpressible, and so you're always searching for a form of language that can communicate at a very profound level, and I think that naturally lends a theologian to be poetic, or seeking poetry and maybe using some of the tools that a poet has. I was very interested when you talk about COP26, because my original academic discipline was economics, and I had to learn to think in a rather different way and communicate in a rather different way when I switched, as it were. And I find myself more comfortable, I guess, expressing things theologically. It seems to be deeply within me. So I totally understand that. I think that the written word is immensely powerful and can be. I think that's why over the centuries totalitarian regimes have burned books. They can be dangerous because people can actually read them and be inspired by them. I totally take on board issues about visual imagery being important as well. But I think the whole way that we can utilize multimedia experience now, there's so much interaction between the written word, the visual, the music, as musical as well. I think together they can be very, very powerful. And I'm thinking also within a church context. You know, we are in a pretty much a bit of a secular bubble in Western Europe, but the rest of the world is pretty religious still, and I think the potential for getting churches and other faith groups to address these sorts of issues through church services, through worship, through liturgy, can also have a very profound and powerful effect. And I hope very much that develops. It probably already is developing in places I'm not aware of, but I hope that develops. And certainly within the Christian context in this country, the creation of Creation Tide in the autumn, I think, is a step in the right direction.
I was very struck as a theologian, or someone who tries to be a theologian, with the wisdom of Christine's line, to be content with the unknown. And I wondered whether, in fact, that was actually good advice to all people like ourselves who struggle perhaps too much to articulate things theologically, but actually rest content with the unknown, not least being taught that by the sea. Lizzie, do you see yourself as a religious writer?
I think that, all artists kind of touch what you might call the collective unconscious, and, visionaries from like the Revelation, John the Divine, they also tapped into that. So I think what people have been touched on as well about how when you connect with nature and you connect with the sea, as people have found in lockdown, you do tend to, it improves your well-being, and you tend to think about higher things and your religious experience. So going back to what you were saying about, what can artists do? I think there is this feeling in visual arts and spoken word and poetry and visual arts that of the eco-crisis, and people are expressing their frustration. I'm expressing my frustration in word and trying to create something beautiful out of that, and perhaps connecting with other artists who are visual, and then spreading the word to a wider audience by displaying and talking. And I think appointments like Kathleen Jamie, who writes about nature, I think that's very important to have that prominent voice that is heard by so many more people.
We've got about 5 minutes or so left, and I wonder whether I could invite any comments from the audience and from anybody here, or questions, or something that you would like to say. I think we've got a microphone that can come round. So, could I invite responses from you, please, as to what we've heard? There's somebody here? A lady here.
Hi, so this is for Mr. Luca, I believe. So I found it interesting how you wrote your poems in both Shetlandian and English, as somebody who is interested in the way that language shapes perception. Do you think that, so did you grow up speaking Shetlandian, I'm guessing? And if so, did that kind of influence the way, like the language did that influence your relationship to the sea and the way that you perceive, its connection with the way it shapes? Sorry, I'm having difficulty articulating this, but...
I think I get what you're saying, yes. In Shetland, we just say we're speaking Shetland. I sometimes refer to it as Shetland Dialect or Shetlandic, and I think language and dialect are interchangeable in my mind. Yes, we were brought up, it was our mother tongue, and I think anyone's mother tongue is what's closest to them, but we also learned to speak English as well. I suppose, the sea in Shetland has had everybody has a relationship with it. Every family would have someone in it who's been a fisherman or a merchant seaman, or and there was a taboo language of the sea. You had to, if you were a fisherman, you couldn't use the normal terms for the land things, all kinds of things like that. But yes, I think it does shape you, because language is just so part of culture and heritage. You can't really sort of distinguish them sometimes. They're very close. So I enjoy writing in both. I think English is a wonderfully, it's a huge language, very capacious and expressive, but I love writing in my mother tongue as well.
Thank you.
What struck me when you were reading in Shetlandic is the power of the word, even if you can't necessarily cognitively understand it immediately. That language can be extraordinarily powerful, almost like music.
I think it's quite onomatopoeic. The meaning is the sound, and the sound is the meaning. the nyarm of the yows, you know, that's the noise of the ooben of the otter, the moaning. I think perhaps dialects especially are very direct. They're not abstract. They don't have a huge list of abstract nouns, so that the words are quite earthy and quite direct, and maybe onomatopoeic if we put it into technique.
Perhaps not earthy so much as, you know, connected with the sea, because in Shetland you're, you know, sea-y. Ed, you were nodding your head at the beginning there. Do you like to contribute something here?
Oh.
You've lost your voice again. No.
I love the idea that English is a capacious language, and I made a note of that because I think that's a useful thing to have in mind as a writer.
Yes, we have another question here.
May I ask all of our three wonderful speakers about the role of the shoreline in their work? I think Christina mentioned this just at the very beginning of her marvelous presentation. So can I ask all three of you just about the role of that frontier, that kind of liminal area within your respective work?
Lizzie, could I ask you to answer that first?
Well, it is a very magical line, isn't it? So the mermaid or the selkie comes onto land and changes and gets legs and becomes a different kind of being in my world. And it's where we walk along when we are land beings, and we walk along and we look out to sea and we try to connect with the sea. Sometimes we go into the waves just a little bit, but we can't go very far out. So I think it's a very magical line, and that's where the imagination starts to take over, I think, between conscious and unconscious. I think it's very interesting. I like the word liminal. I think that really expresses where we are when we walk along that line in reality or in our minds.
Ed, could I ask you to reflect on that?
So that's for me, David.
Yes.
The
notion of the shoreline or the liminal.
Yes, I mean, liminality is something that I thought a lot about and written about in the book, and it's very much how I suppose I got into writing about it, from experiencing living by the sea, looking out. Also, not just looking out across the sea, but where I grew up on the Bristol Channel. From the house that I grew up in, you could see the coastline of Wales across the channel. And I remember very much as a young child looking across there at this mysterious other world that was beyond anything I could conceive. And I could see the lights at night. And then other days, you might be able to see the hills of the Black Mountains, Brecon Beacons. On another day, you couldn't see a thing. It was just completely shielded. And I think a lot of that experience for me spoke to me about otherness, what might lie beyond, and spoke very powerfully. And I think one of the things in the biblical accounts of Jesus by Galilee, obviously it's a lake, not a sea, but there's a lot of action that takes place on the shore of Galilee, and I'm sure that liminality is an important reason for the gospel writers drawing on so much about what happens around Galilee. So absolutely, so important.
Thank you. And Christine?
I have in my mind's eye the waves coming in and watching them just as they hold that energy. And they've come from, well, if we're on the west coast, they'll have come from Newfoundland, you know, they've come so far, and then the actual seabed breaks them, and that surge and power of the sea, I find that a very exciting thing, and it's a beautiful thing to watch, just the way the lip of the wave curves. And watching surfers, I think, is just magical. And then, of course, the walking along the beach and picking up things and the sea life there. That's a great joy to people, I think. It's so restorative in many ways. And I just think also of visiting an old woman in the little island of Skerries in Shetland, and her husband, I think was a fourth cousin to my father, but never mind. He was dead by then, but she had a map on the wall that he'd made of the, and he had put a star for every bottled message he'd found on this little island. He had 70 stars on his world map, and they nearly all come from Norway, and 70 messages which had come from so far. And of course, they linked up with some of these people. And I think the linkage across the sea is lovely too.
Thank you very much. One image that's been, or two images that's been through my mind as we've been listening in the last hour or so. Last week, the week before last, I was staying in a cottage on the Northumberland coast. And the contrast between Thursday night, when the sea was absolutely beautiful and still and reflecting the sunset from the west in just glorious different colours. On Friday night, it was quite different when the storm had arrived and the sea was lashing the coast. An entirely different animal, but yet the same. And those extremes were well expressed in just 24 hours difference there. Sadly, we've come to the end of our hour, but I would like to thank our three speakers very warmly indeed, Christine, Ed, and Lizzie, for all that they've given us in poetry and theology and the Bible and all their reflections. And thank you indeed very much for your questions and for being with us this afternoon. Thank you.